Good afternoon. I am Aphiwe Ngalo. Thank you for joining us for this conversation around dispossession, land removals, forced removals in Cape Town, in South Africa, and in Palestine. Today, I'm joined by three amazing authors. The first one is Haidar Eid, a refugee from Gaza. He is a South African Palestine author and associate professor of the post-colonial, postmodern literature at Gaza's Al-Aqsa University. His books are Worlding, Postmodernism, Interpretive Possibilities of Critical Theory, and Countering the Palestinian Nakba, One State for All. Today, we'll be exploring his decolonizing of the Palestinian mind. Next, we have Dr. Uhuru Phalafala, who is a senior lecturer in the English department at Stellenbosch University, with teaching interests in critical race studies, material and expressive cultures, Black radical traditions, and decoloniality. She is preoccupied with how to be together with ancestral wisdom and those of the land, plants, cosmos, and waters. Today we'll be exploring her book titled Mine, Mine, Mine. And over there we have Lebogang Seale, who is a multi-award winning journalist and media and communications practitioner. He holds a master's degree in journalism and media studies from Wits and has a wealth of experience in the mainstream media spanning over a decade. Today, he brings us 100 years of dispossession, my family's quest to reclaim our land. If we could give them a warm welcome. Now, both South Africa and Palestine know what dispossession is. In South Africa, a walk through our streets will show you what it has done. A walk through the existence, the mere existence of townships illustrates that people have been forcibly removed. And I think we're all aware of what's currently happening in Palestine. And to start us off, Uhuru has prepared a poem to share with all of us. Thank you, Uhuru.
Greetings, everyone. I hope you are well. I wrote this poem last year in May when I visited Palestine. It is a poem in a series of poems. It is part 1 of 6. I will only read part 1. It is called Spells for Palestine. And I think for the purpose of this panel, it could very well work as spells for the dispossessed. Resistance is devotion. Resistance is devotion to self, to lineage, community, and ancestors. Resistance is devotion to land, to love and language, to life. Revolution is a love language. Revolution is devotion to life as love, as creative force, as continuity of the dreams held by those who birthed us. Resistance is the devotional act of birthing the intergenerational prayer, responding to the call of love for lineage, language, and land.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. To start us off today, all three of the authors will be reading an extract from their books. Thereafter, we're going to engage in conversation. We will be leaving 15 to 10 minutes, depending on how our conversation goes, for all of you to engage the panelists. So please hold your questions until then. To start us off, we've got Haidar Eid, reading from Decolonizing the Palestinian Mind.
Well, thank you so much. Let me just start by saying that I'm not into creative writing. I mean, I must admit, and I envy people who have that creativity, you know, when they write. And I'm a critic, literary critic, and I also write, you know, political analysis. And this book, Decolonizing the Palestinian Mind, is a critique, actually, of the two-state solution, which I call the two-prison solution, in fact, racist two-state solution. And the book is a collection of pieces that I have written started writing since 2007. I returned to Gaza in 2005, where I joined the Al-Aqsa University, and I survived 5 massacres, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2020, 21. And I spent the first 2 months of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and I have been displaced 4 times, together with my family. I've lost my home, I've lost my everything, which is nothing compared to sacrifices made by the Palestinian people. And the prologue to this book, actually, the publisher, Comrade Vijay, when they decided to publish this political analysis, he decided to take a piece that I wrote when I was displaced for the 3rd time in the city of Rafah. There was lots of bombing, etc., and the neighbor's house was destroyed, and there were 7 bodies still under the rubble. The rubble, yesterday in my session, I said the most hated word in Gaza is anqad. It's the Arabic word for rubble. The other word that people hate in Gaza is ashla. Ashla, shredded bodies. So I visited this house. You know, people were trying to get those dead bodies from under the rubble, but they remained, I think, for a week. Now, as I speak to you, there are about 15,000 bodies still under the rubble. More than 15,000, in fact. So I couldn't analyze things at that time. And I had a sort of, I'm secular in my life. I mean, yeah, but I had a sort of an out-of-body experience. And when I was looking at, you know, the rubble, etc., I imagined, you know, myself. I mean, it could have been me. I imagined myself being, you know, under the rubble. So I wrote this piece, and then my friend Ali Abu Ni'ma from Electronic Intifada decided to post it. Then the publisher insisted, you know, on using it as a prologue. And I'm going to read just a tiny piece. I mean, as we said. My ghost pats one of my university students, a brilliant student, on the shoulder who lost her family, offering her a tissue to wipe her tears. It embraces her father and carries her little sister, who weeps as she searches for their mother under the rubble. Ghosts do not cry. My ghost is an exception. This incident must be recorded as that of the first weeping ghost in history. My ghost sings to the pretty woman sitting on a rock in the middle of what was once a home that contained dreams, hopes, and desires. My ghost wipes her tears and weeps along with her. My ghost reflects on the pain of birth. My ghost goes to the Nusayrat refugee camp. In Nusayrat, my ghost hears the cooing of a dove coming from the south, from Khan Yunis. The dove bears the story of another home. The home is a lover, a woman who has feelings for you and for whom you have feelings. She's you and you are her. There are no boundaries, no separation. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. The first ghost in history to cry. Thank you. Uhuru?
I will read from my epic poem, Mine, Mine, Mine. It is the story of my grandfather, who worked in the gold mines of Johannesburg. I'm from Limpopo, and he would go work in the mines as a lekgolwa, a migrant laborer, and come home 2 weeks in a year during Christmas. And so it is a story about my grandfather, but it also is a story about my grandmother and my mother and myself. And I'll read a short excerpt from page 62, those who have it. History in my body. A history of personalities and laws of war, dominant in muscle memory. History that turns the tide of centuries-old violence against us, the unspoken and unsung. I write this history residing in my body. It resounds in yours too. In speaking of widows and wives of history, we speak to ourselves. When it dies a violent death, as it often does, history returns to wives and grandmothers. And children too, protected by the waters of their mothers' bodies. We are those children. And like water, we remember. History's tide swells within us in full moon during the constant endings and beginnings of our bodies remaking themselves with blood every month. Blood that separates us from our fathers and brothers in the mosque. We sing its name, our foremothers' refrain.
Thank you so much, and afternoon, everybody. Good to see you. So I'll be reading a short extract from my book titled 100 Years of Dispossession, My Family's Quest to Reclaim Our Land. So I'll be reading from the introductory part, which comes after a foreword by retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke. And just to say that one Sisonke Msimang, whom some of you would know, has also done a shout-out quote. And so is one professor who has written extensively on soul plucking. So this story, the setting of the story is in Limpopo, in the region of Mojadji's Kloof, so-called rainmaking queen. Some of you would know. I'm not sure about those prowess, if they still exist. That's a story for another day. The region is very fertile. There's one of the prominent farmers in this country called ZZ2, hails from there. So a portion of our land is owned by ZZ2. Right. Here we go. The road from Johannesburg to my ancestral home in Limpopo province cuts through savanna grassland dotted with trees and shrubs as it winds its way to the densely forested, misty mountain of Makgoba's Kloof. The mountain yields rivers and streams that meander further to the Lowveld. Across the foothills lies the Letaba Valley, acre and acre of fertile land stretching into the distance. Laced with verdant tracks, this is prime land. And near the Muketi outpost in the Greater Letaba municipality lies my home, this crown jewel, with its sloping hills, fragrant forests, and abundance of tropical and subtropical fruit trees. But that is only a distant nostalgia now, for the land is no longer ours. Today, it belongs to the descendants of colonial settlers, strangers who came from far-off places and claimed it as their own. As in other parts of the country, the claiming of this land was an arbitrary and capricious land grab, enforced with no regard for its owners' rights and sovereignty. The occupation altered the trajectory of our lives on a scale that is unimaginable. As the community's rights diminished, our status on the land was downgraded to labor tenants, living and working on the whims of white farmers, subjected to the harsh and often inhuman conditions. As such, our family and the wider community had to adapt to a world where survival became a struggle, a battle between life and death. Behind what has been described as original sin was a skewed legislation that encouraged and orchestrated the oppression and subjugation of indigenous people. And so, to reach home, I must travel still further to the northeast, to the hotter and drier rural hinterland of South Africa.
While reading Lebogang's book, I remembered when I saw the ZZ2, I was like, that sounds so familiar. And I remember it was one of the companies that a lot of people were calling us to boycott, to show solidarity and for the sanctions to Palestine. And I think that it's just a story about how power is connected and how in as much as we are connected, disconnected as the dispossessed, so they are. And they help each other sort of sustain this way of being, this capitalism that keeps the poor, the black, and usually the indigenous people of these different places that we come from in very hostile situations. Haidar, one thing that you are criticizing in your book is the Oslo Accord. And I think one thing that is similar to South Africa is the constant either grandstanding or the adoption of policies that are seemingly progressive. However, what we see is that the people who are said to benefit from these policies don't get to. I'd love for you to just expand on that and maybe speak to us about the lived realities, not only of Palestinian people who are refugees, but Palestinian people who find themselves in Gaza and the Palestinian people who maybe find themselves in Israeli territories.
Yeah, thank you. Very important question indeed, and I want to start by quoting my late mother. And I remember very well in 1993, the Oslo Accords between the leadership of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and apartheid Israel at the time. It was signed in 1993. So the first reaction, my mother was illiterate; she couldn't read and write, but she was a refugee from the Zarnuga village, which was ethnically cleansed back in 1948. So in 1993, when you said, well, Yasser Arafat has decided to sign the Oslo Accords with apartheid Israel, she said, okay, very good. Does that mean I am returning tomorrow to Zarnuga? So that was her first reaction. And the answer was no. She said, no, this is terrible. This is terrible. And I think this, coming from her, sums up the problem with the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were, in the words of Edward Said, I mean, it was a sort of a Palestinian surrender to the occupier, to the colonizer. Two problems, two major problems. The first problem is that the Oslo Accords do not deal at all, whatsoever, with Palestinian right to self-determination. Number two, the Palestinian Accords, in a way, managed to reduce the Palestinian people only to those who live in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. That is to say, 1/3 of the Palestinian people. Okay, what about 1.4 million Palestinians living as third-class citizens in the State of Israel, completely ignored by the Oslo Accords? What about 6 to 7 million Palestinian refugees living in the diaspora and in refugee camps, both in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, all over the world, Syria, Jordan, etc., etc. Not a single word about the Palestinian refugees. Then the question becomes, what is the meaning of self-determination, if not our basic rights, if not our right to freedom? Israel, in 1967, decided to occupy the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, still occupying the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and this is illegal. Not a single country in the world recognizes that legality. In 1948, 2/3 of the Palestinian people were dispossessed. In the words of Israel's great historian, Ilan Pappé, ethnically cleansed. One of my favorite books is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, written by Ilan Pappé, an anti-Zionist Israeli Jew. And not a single word, as I said, about the right of return, but we have United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for the right of return of Palestinian refugees and their compensation. So, in other words, the Oslo Accords was, on the one hand, Israel, the PLO recognizing Israel as a state, its right to exist, and on the other hand, Israel refusing to recognize the Palestinian people as a people, but recognizing the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people. And that is the beginning of the problem. And this is why I followed the legacy of Edward Said, Ghassan Kanafani, Mahmoud Darwish, our greatest poet, who were very, very critical of the Oslo Accords at the time.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think maybe Lebogang, you could come in here. We all know that South Africa got a new constitution post-apartheid, and it's been hailed as the most progressive. But your family's history and the story you walk us through in your book illustrates something else.
Yeah.
Could you talk us through your family's history and your quest to reclaim the land?
Thank you, absolutely. And my fellow panelist here speaks about the beginning. Okay, and so it's important within the South African situation to context these matters. It's been well documented that there was a raft of legislation that was introduced pertaining to land, and a chief of which was the Land Act of 1913, which in fact formalized a situation that had been happening for at least more than 3 centuries. So with that, and it was not just about the Land Act of 19, there were others, as I indicated. But with that, a situation quickly developed, or rather intensified, where the racial profiling of people and the group to which they belonged determined their opportunities in terms of access to land, access to jobs, access to economic opportunities, education, health, and so forth. So that was part of the problem. But we're talking about land here. It's important to know that we're talking about land. Land is a very important asset. human history is anchored on land. It gives you rootedness. It gives you sanctity, identity, dignity. That is the land. So, but then with regards to our family and our community, what happened? A situation of almost seismic proportions happened overnight. People, unprovoked, just came and said, it's our land. From tomorrow, you work for us. Unprovoked. And so what happened? They usurped our land. They subjugated us. And while exploiting our resources on the land. But there was something more sinister to that, as I reflect in the book. As the rightful owners of land, we were either treated as slaves or we were banished to places away from the riches of that land. Because the places that we were pushed to, drier, as I indicated. So, there's a lasting legacy to that. Because once you are pushed away from your land to those drier areas, what it does is to create a dependency syndrome, and a crippling one for that matter. Because then you are forced to keep going back to the very same land that you had been pushed from for employment. Because you absolutely don't have any opportunities. In fact, in the book, as I write, hardly a month after our family had settled at that village where we had been pushed to, the same farmer came knocking on the door and say, hey, we want you must come and work for us. But what could my mom do? She went back, and I said, we were young. I said, why are you going back? What shall you eat? What shall you eat if I don't go back? I may look well now and sound and sane when you look at me, but I walk around carrying this wound. It's deep, scars that I'm walking around with. And these scars are not healing. It's emotional, it's psychological as well. Because of the stolen land. So the effects, the impact are long-lasting. People sometimes don't realize what dispossession does to people.
Thank you.
Pause there. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for that vulnerability. Uhuru, you open with this line. In 2018, the historic, struggling with this word, silicosis class action lawsuit against the mining industry in South Africa was settled in favor of the miners. The miners are dead. And while you're speaking, Lebogang, I think I'm just reminded and hopeful and sad, actually, at the same time, a lot of emotions. One, because you're still here. You're still here, you're still writing, and you're still trying to reclaim your family's land. But in the situation that you describe, Uhuru, the miners are dead. And before they die, you explore this idea of people dying before they truly leave this earth. And I'd love for you to maybe take us through your family's experience. Like I said at the beginning, I think when we walk through our cities and where we live, we're able to see the effects of apartheid, of colonialism. But like Lebogang is saying, we sit here as people, and we sit with those scars. And as families, we experience people who've been violated over and over again. So if you could just maybe share a bit about your book and how it explores that.
Yeah, sure. So I use the story of my grandfather, as I have already mentioned, who was a miner in the gold mines of Johannesburg during apartheid. But I use his story and mobilize it to speak to these histories that we are talking about that can be traced centuries back. And I look at just the title of your book, The 100 Years War of Dispossession, that were really systemic attack on the theft of land and the theft of cattle to decimate our economic system, our governance system, our spiritual worlds. And I look at those wars leading to the Land Act as world-ending events that ended the worlds and the world systems of the local people as we know it, and subsumed them under a new economic system. And that is how my grandfather ends up working in the mine, a new economic system that extracted not only the land of its diamonds and its gold, but also extracted black families and black societies and black communities of their boys and their men, of my grandfather, and really decimated that too, the system of the black family and the system of the black community, and we see the effects of that today. And so I was interested in looking at his journey as his granddaughter, so writing from a very personal place about what it has meant for my grandmother to shoulder the burden of raising her children and grandchildren without the presence of her husband, who came home 2 weeks in a year during Christmas, and every time he came, he was less himself, so to say. He was, becoming the ghost that you write about. He was emptied of the grandfather we know, the husband we know, the father we know, as it pertains to my mother. But I'm also interested in extraction of land, the diamond and gold mining. And I think of it also as just the foundation of a Southern African modernity. So it's not particularly a South African problem, it's a regional problem, Southern Africa, because the miners came from other South African or Southern African countries. And I think of extraction that built this global capitalist economy as tied to black women's wombs. That the making of this racial capitalism, this global economy that we know that is built on plantation economies, that is built on slavery in the Cape here, and that is built on the mining industry at large, is directly and inextricably tied to black women's wombs. In fact, extraction is the extraction of labor, as I explore in my epic. It is the exploitation and extraction of labor as toil, so muscle, work, labor, but it is also the extraction and exploitation of reproductive labor. So if we are to think of the images of mining, for instance, in South Africa, they are all limited to the cities. We see black men in hard hats and gumboots, and we see them descend into the womb of the earth. We see the mining compound, but hardly do we ever see where these boys and men come from, where they've been extracted, their mothers, their grandmothers, the children that they have left behind, which are the same people who receive their bodies when they die in these mines. When they die, because their lifespans have been reduced so radically, right? They are received by these mothers who birthed them. And so for me, this is the exploration here. Dispossession, that's tied to extraction. How it sits in black women's bodies. How it sits intergenerationally in our bodies. The poem I've just read, History in My Body, explores that, and how we continue to feel the effects of that history of extraction in our bodies. So I question a pandemic, I'm gonna call it, like fibroids in black women. Why do black women disproportionately experience and suffer from fibroids more than any other race? Could we link and create some kind of ties to what I am talking about a global capitalist system that's tied to black women's wombs?
No, sure. And I think, thank you for sharing that. And the beauty, I think, of storytelling, and I think we can all agree, is how it sort of amplifies and gives light to the hidden. And I think then it is through storytelling that we are able to assess the system and say the story is the story of so many. Surely it is not the individual's maybe lifestyle or habits. Surely there could be something else at play here. And that's when we start asking the important questions and start targeting the people that we need to target. The next question I wanted for us to explore is the idea of the left, but also Uhuru, in your book, there's a poem that speaks on the command that was given in Marikana that led to the Marikana massacre. And Lebogang, for you, you speak of the trend there. Yes, dispossession was done very violently, and we hoped to see something different post-1994. However, what has happened is that those who were involved in our liberation as a country are and have become sort of the lead looters. They've become the guardians of the system. They've become the people. Political party funding, for example, is an example of this, of whose interests they have. And you also question the left in Palestine. You speak about the PFLP and the DFLP and say maybe they have failed people and they need to relook. So when the radicals, or the people who used to be seen as radicals, are the ones who have failed people, where to from here? What do we do? How do we move forward? And I'd love for us to engage in conversation about that.
All right, thank you. Actually, it's a very serious question. And I think the left worldwide suffers from a crisis, which has started with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 90s, until today. But since we are talking about Palestine in particular, you mentioned the PFLP and DFLP. And for those of you who don't know, you know the acronym. PFLP is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. DFLP is the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Both are Marxist organizations. The DFLP is more of a Maoist-leaning organization. And I think one of the most serious problems that we have right now in Palestine is, and again, this is a critique and self-critique in a way, emanates from the fact that the Palestinian left has failed to offer an alternative. We talked about the Oslo Accords, and we said that the Oslo Accords never dealt with our right to self-determination, right of return, freedom, and equality. The Palestinian left, unfortunately, dovetailed the Palestinian right by definitely by joining the PLO, and I'm saying the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, but it has been monopolized by the right, by the Palestinian right. I'm referring here people who are familiar with the Palestinian question to the Fatah movement. Fatah movement represents the secular right, and we've ended up having a very serious internal clash between Fatah on the one hand, which represents the secular right, and the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, which represents the religious right. Without the left being able to offer an alternative. Now, many people believe, and I know pro-Israel people here think that Hamas want to destroy Israel, etc., forgetting actually the fact that in 2017, Hamas, as a nationalist organization now, changed its charter to endorse the two-state solution, to endorse a racist solution. Now, what was the reaction of the Palestinian left at that time? They accepted that. What was the reaction of the Palestinian left vis-à-vis the Oslo Accords? Formal rejection. They opposed the Oslo Accords, but they decided to join the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. And that, in a way, created a contradiction. My problem with the Palestinian left is that it still endorses a racist solution, the two-state solution. And I think this emanates from its Stalinist background, exactly like in the Communist Party in South Africa and other parts of the world. Now, the alternative that the book is trying to offer here, as I said, building on the legacy of Edward Said, etc., is a one-state solution. A secular democratic state for all of its citizens, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, etc. Now, some of the leaders of the Palestinian left take that as a utopian solution. And this reminds me of the kind of arguments we used to have in the 70s and 80s about turning South Africa into a state for all of its citizens. And people would accuse us of being, offering a utopian solution because blacks and whites cannot live together. The elections in the mid-80s in South Africa, most whites voted for a racist party. Why do you think that blacks and whites will want to live together? And now this is the same argument, unfortunately, that is being offered by the Palestinian left. The third point, and I think this is extremely important, is that the Palestinian left has not learned from the South African experience, especially the failures, the pitfalls of racial consciousness. Frantz Fanon, when he discussed the Algerian Revolution, I mean, one of my favorite chapters in his Richard of the Earth is the pitfalls of national consciousness. As if Frantz Fanon did not exist. The Palestinian left does not understand that. And in 2006, when we were asked, he refers to the people, to the residents of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, we were asked to vote for our representatives in the Legislative Council. Unfortunately, the Legislative Council is one of the institutions of the Oslo Accords. The Palestinian left actually joined the elections. And I was opposed to those elections. I remain opposed to those elections as long as we have occupation. The priority goes to resisting occupation and colonialism. You cannot vote freely under the barrel of the gun of the occupier. You go or we kill you. And you choose who we want you to choose. But people in 2006 actually voted against the two-state solution, against the Oslo Accords, and this is why apartheid Israel decided to impose a deadly siege, leading to the genocide we are going through right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. I like the way you premised this, because you also spoke about how violent the dispossession was, and indeed, land dispossession was an immoral act. It set in a tragic chain of events for indigenous people. But now there was the grand promise that came with the arrival of democracy. There was a reason why land restitution and land reform were a signpost and a flagship project for democracy in South Africa. So, as the people who lost their land, we keep waiting for the land that never returns. And there is a reason for that. It has been described as the elite capture by our public representatives. The very same people who profess to be representing us are the ones who are betraying us. Every day, I see some of these high-ranking politicians, apart from the grandstanding and the rhetoric around land reform, they dine with some of the they wine and dine with some of the commercial farmers. I mentioned there Makhoba's Kloof. It's a very exotic place. You see them there having tea, coffee, wine, brine, and all of that. I don't want to mention name, but the high-ranking politicians, that's fine, but it's in the book.
Named and shamed.
So you see them. I'm not saying it's wrong to meet up with ZZ2, the CEO, and all of that. But what about the promise of the land? Okay? You know, our people, until such time that they realize that greed, avarice, destroys everything that it touches. It destroys everything that we cherish for as a nation. Education, health, and the provision of other basic services. Now, they're talking about NHI. One can't help but wonder how they are going to manage that. So, the theme that emerges from this book is the one of the great betrayal. Don't beat me. There are many white people in this country who understand the principle of land reform. And in fact, some of the white people are supportive of this, and they have reached out to government. They say, look, we can help, because this thing is threatening property and investment and all of that. We can assist. We understand this. But it's our people, the so-called liberators, who are betraying us. Thank you.
Thank you. Uhuru?
Yeah, and just to pick up from that, I'll read the last poem in Mine, Mine, Mine. And it states that gold and diamond mining is the white pot at the beginning of the Rainbow Nation.
Sure.
That is a lot to process. But we're just going to give an opportunity to the audience to engage with us. I'm going to take one question at a time. There's a question over there, bottom. Was that a question? Not a question. Question from Tando over there. And we're going to do one question at a time.
Thank you, everyone, for what you have already said. My question comes from what Untate Lebogang Seale said about people don't realize what dispossession does. And I want to know, how do we reconcile as South Africans, or as anyone who's dispossessed, how do we reconcile with, how do I put this? I don't know how to formulate it. So my point is, we've always lived around this being dispossessed, all right? I'll make an example. My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother had to leave the Eastern Cape to the Free State because of the wars that were happening at the time. They settled there, and my grandmothers were born. But they've always moved around the Free State as this Xhosa family that didn't have a place to stay because they came from the Eastern Cape. That led to us as a family moving around Bloemfontein the whole time just to be able to find a grounding. So at which point are we going to be able to move forward as a collective and live with this dispossessedness, because it is within us? As Tata says, we walk around with these scars. So how do we reconcile with being dispossessed, because it's our way of living, basically?
Thank you, Tando. You can
The
take
beauty about that is that, in part, you also provided an answer. And then the reason your family find itself moving from one place to another, wandering, strangers in many parts, is because you had been cut off from your nourishing roots, which is your original land. This should be your nourishing root, but you've been cut off. Now you are searching for the new home that you never find. So you are these now wandering strangers. And also, in the process, it means you also searching for your new identity, because with land comes issues of identity as well. And also, it affects you in terms of your livelihood and trying to be stable economically and otherwise. So the effects thereof are far-reaching. Now, how do we move forward? That is it's a big question. And I'm not sure if I have the answer to that. But what I can say is that as a country, we are in an emergency situation. And I suppose there's a reason why today we are in a government of national unity. And because we are in an emergency situation. As to whether I have the solutions, I don't know. But it will demand the reconstruction of the soul, as I indicated, for people to realize that greed destroys everything that it touches and everything that we aspire and cherish. That is the problem. Under the current circumstances, the people who have led us for over 30 years abysmally, dismally failed us. It has to be said.
Thank you. I to also just add to that, I think sometimes we do feel quite disempowered as individuals who have gone through a dispossession. But I think we have a lot of examples of different movements in Cape Town, in Durban, in the southern region, of people organizing and coming together to do something about this land question. This is not the end. People can still come together, and together we can find a solution and pressure those who are in power to do things differently. And it is that we mustn't lose. Because if we stay in our little corners and work in silos and say, oh my gosh, it's so terrible, we'll continue being victims of this very violent system. There was another question over there. Gentleman with the hat in the third row. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Oh, right over here.
Hi, thank you for your powerful sentiments. So it's quite clear the dispossessed have been dispossessed for a long time. How can they repossess? And secondly, this is to Prof. Decolonization is important at this point, but it's always been framed as we need to decolonize the minds of the oppressed. Who is going to take the responsibility of decolonizing the minds of the oppressors when they are benefiting from the system?
Sure. Difficult questions.
That's not for me.
Two questions.
How do we repossess? So I feel like 30 years in, we are still swallowing the bitter betrayal of our leaders. And the hope that we speak of as a dangerous pursuit is shaken and has to be called upon. Yesterday, in a session on exile, I was talking about how even when we have been dispossessed of the land, we are still on the land. We still have access to the land. We still have access to our languages. We still have access to our lineages, to intergenerational wisdom, intergenerational resistance. Alongside intergenerational trauma, there is also resistance that we can learn from and wisdom that we can learn. And those can create pathways to home ourselves, to create some form of home, because access to the land also means access to potentially our spiritual practices, and we can fortify ourselves spiritually. And I think that, that is something that has not come up yet on this panel, the decimation of our spiritual practices that have held us together over the centuries. And I feel that the pathway into that kind of repair and healing that we require is to fortify ourselves spiritually. And that can happen through land, and that is already happening. And having said that hope is a dangerous pursuit, I am hopeful because I do see people, movements, and organizations and individuals doing work that matters towards repossessing ourselves and repossessing our belonging to the land.
And I thought that was a very important question. One thing about it is that the more land reform drags on without being resolved, then it creates skepticism and also cynicism around it. Then people begin to say, what for?
It's not possible.
What will you do with the land? We must move forward and forget. So, because it's dragging for too long without any resolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of hope, I mean, crossed my mind one of the poems by Mahmoud Darwish. What do you do as a Palestinian? We nurture hope, he said. We nurture hope within the same context that you're talking about. Decolonizing the mind. And of course, the original title, it's a book written by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind, about language, etc., etc. The debate between Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. But within the context of Palestine, it's a classical case of anti-colonial struggle, anti-colonial for liberation, freedom, etc., etc. And I think, decolonizing the mind is a precondition for the decolonization of the land. With a colonized mind, you cannot decolonize the land. And what Frantz Fanon taught us, again, I can't remember, I think Black and White Masks, is that when you resist the colonizer as a colonized, first you rehumanize yourself and you rehumanize the colonizer. Because you can prove to the colonizer that you are a human being and that you can resist. And I think within the Palestinian cause, notice, I'm not talking about, the 7th of October, whether it's correct or not correct, but notice, after the 7th of October, the whole world is talking about Palestine, is talking about Gaza, for various reasons, of course. But the act of decolonization in Palestine has not just started, on the 7th of October. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, a classical case of settler colonialism based on the idea of, as Patrick Wolf, I think, who calls elimination of the native. Elimination of the native, maximum land, minimum natives. And by proving that you exist as a human being, by proving that you can fight back in order to have your basic rights back, you are in a way decolonizing the mind of the colonizer. Thank you. Oof, time is up.
I think time is up, but we could take one more question, if there is a question. Okay, no questions. I want to thank you all for your beautiful work. It is about hope, and it's about holding on to hope and trying to imagine a different world where the dispossessed return to their land and where we are allowed to thrive and not just survive. So with that, I'd like to thank you all.